I'll remind you to turn off your cell phones or anything else that goes beep or bleep or makes an annoying little sound. Alrighty. My name is Connie Hassett. I'm a member of the board for the Princeton Adult School, and it's my pleasure to do the introduction tonight. Our speaker is Joel Smith. He is the Peter C. Bunnell Curator of Photography at the Princeton University Art Museum. Since 2005, he has organized 14 exhibitions at the museum. These are the equivalent of books. If you go online at the museum, you can see many photos, illustrations, textbooks worth of text to go with the online setup for the exhibition. Anyway, 14 of these, including Beloved Daughters, What is a Thing, Pictures of Pictures, and the two current exhibitions, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen, The Life and Death of Buildings, and also Lee Friedlander, Cars, and The New Cars. Joel received his undergraduate degree in 1988 from the University of California at Berkeley, and he has a PhD from Princeton, received in 2000. In 2006, his retrospective of the artist Saul Steinberg opened at the Morgan Library and Museum in Manhattan, and then went on to appear in 4 American and 4 European venues. His talk tonight, as you can see on our big board, is Photography in and Out of the Museum. Please welcome Joel Smith.
Thank you very much. It sounds as though everybody can hear me fine, but wave your arms madly if you find that I'm dropping out. Well, thanks very much for coming this evening. What I'm going to do tonight is try to give my answer anyway for the question that comes up so often in variously casual or more formal contexts when a person meets up with a curator. It's the equivalent of what the doctor experiences at a party when someone starts to roll up their sleeve and show them the problem. Namely, why is X in a museum? Why is that in a museum? I don't know if I experience that more often than curators of painting and sculpture, but there is something special about photography and about its place in the museum, and it has to do with its place out of the museum. When we ask about a painting or a sculpture, why is that in a museum, it means more or less, why is that, in some people's eyes, art? Why is that qualified to represent art in this context? With photography, it's a different question, and it has a more complex set of answers. Photography is in the museum for a variety of reasons. In the case of a university museum, such as Princeton's, it might serve sometimes to teach technical points to students of the medium, those working in the darkroom, and now in the computer lab to create photographs. It may be there, in some cases, to help communicate something about that technical history to art historians, which is a very different thing, but something equally connected to the technological facet of the medium. Sometimes photographs are the most expedient way to communicate points about social history and about the connection of images to traditions that include the scientific, the medical, and so forth. It may also be there precisely for the reason that I'm going through now, that is to exemplify some of the range of non-artistic and non-scientific uses that photography have served, but which have affected art and have affected the history of art, both within photography and in other media, including photography's use in fields as diverse as anthropology, social activism and propaganda, design and architecture, archaeology, sports and performance, journalism, elite and popular portraiture, both public and private, fashion. It goes on and on. The value of photography, its use to us, and the reason why it's worth looking at in the way that we look at art, which is what I'm going to propose, is the reason why it belongs in the art museum. The reason why it's worth looking at the way that we look at art is that it is so ubiquitous, that it's all around us, and we need to understand it and look closely at it and to understand it as a visual language or as a concatenation of lots of visual languages. But its ubiquity is also photography's problem. If it's everywhere, how do you choose what it is that makes sense to put into a museum? And this is really the question that I guess you get most often, is how did you choose that picture instead of this other one? Photography is a medium of art, just as words are. Words go into poems and novels and any number of other uses, operatic, libretti, and so forth. But like words, most photographs are deployed for mundane purposes, not poetical ones. Laundry lists, owner's manuals, stump speeches, gossip, and stop signs. I want to show you in about 15 cases and covering about 5 categories of answer to the question, what is the relevance of this work, or why does it belong in the museum? Why some photographs belong in the museum, even when, and perhaps especially when, art played no part in bringing them into existence. So this concludes the portion in which the light is on me, and from now on you can look up at the screen. I think all art historians secretly wish to be in the back, speaking from the shadows, so that you look at the art. Will the lights go down when I begin the slides? Maybe take down these lights. Oh, they can't? Oh, okay. All right. All right. I hope you'll be able to see the pictures pretty well. So I start very firmly with a foot in the art world. This is a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz. And in fact is one of the group of about 90 photographs by Stieglitz that I wrote my dissertation about here at Princeton. His last concerted project as an artist. Alfred Stieglitz, born in Hoboken in 1864 and active from around the turn of the century until his death in 1946 in New York City, both as an artist and as a gallerist and a publisher of Camera Work magazine. Connected in many ways to the development of modernism in the 20th century in the US. And this photograph is part of a group that he made from the high-rise windows of both his apartment. This is the view from the apartment he shared with Georgia O'Keeffe at the Shelton, which today is the East Side Marriott Hotel, looking northwest, and also from his gallery, which lies just outside the frame on the left. It's the building right across the street from the one that you see the skeleton of as it's going up in construction there. And the thing about these pictures is that Stieglitz made them as long as construction was going on outside his windows, and he stopped around the time the construction stopped, which was early on in the Depression, when the projects that needed to be completed were completed and new ones were not being capitalized. And although they're images of construction and of what we might think of as the birth of new social spaces and the growth of the city and things that we normally associate with a somewhat optimistic social view, for Stieglitz, the view was a tragic one. It had really most of all to do in his life and his experience with the loss of the city, which for him was much more real. The city that was down at street level, the city he had largely grown up in, and the place where he had made his name as a young photographer, photographing people in the street with what was known at that time in the 1890s as a detective camera, a camera you could hold in your hand and be amid the crowd and photograph it. So this combination of factors, that we're looking at both a very romantic and beautiful vision of the city at a moment when its skyscrapers are still on the rise, and that for the maker of the picture, it's something rather tragic, helps us to identify the kind of artist that Stieglitz is. He's a romantic. He sees the poetry and the potential tragedy lurking behind every beautiful thing that he can't help but make beautiful in his pictures. This is one very clean and defined branch of artistic photography, that of invoking the emotions connected with the sight of the world discovered through the camera. Very different kind of perspective, and I'm showing 3 pictures here at the beginning that are all in the show, The Life and Death of Buildings, that was just mentioned. A picture by Lynn Cohen made in the 1970s We're still looking at the New York skyline, but in a very different way. It's a motel room, a photo mural on the wall of the motel room, probably somewhere in the Midwest, either in the US or in Canada. Cohen is as far, I think, as you can get from being a romantic photographer, although she's using exactly the same apparatus that Stieglitz was, an 8x10 view camera, and photographing, as we see here, sometimes literally the very same phenomena, such as the skyline. But what Cohen was photographing was the interiors of American spaces that struck her as puzzling or comical or somehow ironic in ways that she didn't quite have words for. And she said that many of the pictures that she made in the course of this series were mistaken by people when she showed them to them for spaces that she had created, that she had assembled the things in the scene. And nothing could have been further from the truth. She described them as ready-mades, using the term that Marcel Duchamp used. Something that was handed to her by the society as sort of more complex and more puzzling and more contradictory space than she would have been able to come up with on her own. A very different sensibility being deployed, despite the similarity and the straightness, as we use the term, of the photographic technique. Still very firmly in the artistic tradition, but somewhere different emotionally and cognitively than those two. Work by Emmett Gowan, who taught photography for many years here at Princeton, of course, made in Petra, Jordan, in 1983. A view of tombs, broken open tombs in the outer Sikh of Petra, photographed from inside a broken open tomb. I use this picture to conclude the catalog of the life and death of buildings in order to suggest that if you had a camera that had extremely slow film in it, and I don't mean film so slow that people blurred when you made a portrait of them, but so slow that it took a few centuries or 25 centuries to make a picture with that film, you might wind up with a picture of Petra that was somewhat like this. It's a picture in which there's not people, there's not the signs of people, such as the paint that may have at one time been on the surface of these rocks. You don't see any sign of the passing seasons, the plant life, the animal life, the anecdotal genre existence of humanity, and yet you're looking at a world that's shaped by human hands. And that is, in a nutshell, the temporal message of the exhibition as a whole. That photography gives us the long-term view of built human spaces, and that in a particular image like this one, which combines, I would say, the romanticism of Stieglitz with something like the removed skepticism of somebody like Lynn Cohen, you can see somebody trying to speak through photographs in a way distinct from what any manual artist would be able to do, somebody creating a drawing, using technology to somehow step outside of the merely human point of view. Maybe that's the ultimate romantic use of the medium. A very different tradition in art, just to bring in a fourth complication in this genre, would be this one. A photograph by Lotte Jacobi that I included in an exhibition last year called Mid-Century, photographs made in the 1940s and 1950s, circulating around the date of 1950, in other words. Lotte Jacobi had been a portrait photographer in Berlin, the third in her family, but came to the US when the Nazis rose to power in Germany, and in the US, feeling disconnected from the social powers that had been the basis of her work in Germany, she turned to a very abstract mode of photography. And what we're looking at here is something that's as far as it could be from the straight camera technique of either Stieglitz or Lynn Cohen or Emmett Gowan. So far, in fact, that a camera is not even involved in the making of this photograph. Jacobi called her cameraless photographs photogenics. Imagine, if you will, the sheet of paper that you're looking at. It's a piece of paper about this size, about 14 inches on the short side of it. Laying it down in a dark room, lying things down on top of it, in this case probably 2 long coils of paper such as would come out of a cash register, and then pointing with a pen light at those pieces of paper so that the light would deflect and casts shadows and bright light onto different parts of the paper. A very subtle process. It's very hard to define in an image such as this one, which is simply the developed photographic paper that has been subjected to that treatment, what the referent is. We can't say what this is a photograph of. There is no of. The preposition is dropped out. It's become something which is clearly photographic. It is graphic. It's written with light right on that piece of paper. And yet the thing that we normally watch for in a photograph to identify what this is a window onto has ceased to be a part of the equation. It's a very specific tradition in artistic photography that has its equivalent in very few fields outside of art. So this may be the sort of ne plus ultra of artistic photography. It's pushing the medium to do what abstract painting and sculpture were doing in those decades of the 1940s and 50s, something that was still a pretty exciting adventure for those working in photography. The image appeared, this print itself is mounted on a piece of masonite that's quite thick, and the reason that it is on that mount, as anybody who's in the photography field would be able to tell you pretty quickly, is that that's the way that Edward Steichen prepared the photographs that he put on view when he was curating exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art. When you see a photograph by an identifiable photographer that's been treated that way, it's a pretty good indication that it, at some point in its history, appeared at MoMA. And indeed, this photograph did. This is an image in which Jacobi's photograph appears, along with the second work by her, in a show that Steichen produced at MoMA on abstraction in photography in 1951. To make clear where the picture is, it's right there. The image just below it is Jacobi's other photograph. It's another photogenic that's very dark, while this one is quite light. Notice that the pictures that are around it are everything from scientific images produced in a lab to other artistic images, sometimes some of them made from an aerial perspective, and pictures that come from sort of all walks of life, but which in Steichen's view qualified as abstraction. Not in the way that Jacobi was making her work qualify, but very much in the eye of the beholder. And that spirit of connecting work that's made for one reason to work that's made for other reasons, is the next genre that I want to talk about. I've talked about art, and now I want to talk about another value that comes out of looking at photographs, and another thing that we can think about very effectively by looking at photographs, that of connection. Most of the pictures that I'm showing you are ones that I've acquired for the museum in the past few years, and this is one of those. It's a piece by a man named John Hall Edwards, and its title is simply the wording that you see right here. This is a piece of cardboard that has mounted on it the photograph at the center. Midland Tire, as photographed by the Röntgen rays for the Midland Non-Collapsible Tire Company Limited in Birmingham, England. The interest of this object, this piece of ephemera, as some would probably call it, for me, was the connection to the Röntgen rays here, which are, of course, the X-ray. If you look at the inscription that's on the photograph, it says Midland Tire Non-Collapsible, licensed under Welch Dunlop patents, there at the top left. Below, it says copyright, and then at the right, on the bottom, Paul Edwards, the photographer's name, or the X-ray maker's name. And then the date, 28th of January, 1897. The interest is this. John Hall Edwards was a doctor, a surgeon, and somebody who became expert in X-rays before anybody else in England. The connections between Birmingham and state-of-the-art science in Germany were very close, and this doctor in Birmingham happens to be the first in England to really master the use of the X-ray. It's 1896 that Röntgen patents his process, and here we are in January of 1897, the first British person making use of this scientific marvel. And what's he using it for? To advertise non-collapsible bicycle tires for the company in the town where he had his practice. This is the connectivity of photography. This is photography connecting one world to another in this unexpected way, a non-scripted way that has everything to do with the fact that photography wasn't born in order to be art. Its artistic use needed to be discovered, and even after it was discovered, there were lots of people doing a lot of other things that are every bit as creative as the things that artists do. And in fact, Hall Edwards was himself an amateur photographer who exhibited in amateur photographic venues as well. At the same time that the X-ray was coming into use in such unexpected ways, and this is not a photograph in the collection, these are not pictures at Princeton, but I show them just to invoke this genre of imagery being made at the same time. Spirit photography, photographs of ghosts and spirits, and the notion that you could channel beings from beyond and somehow fix them on a negative and thereby verify their reality, their existence. The X-ray came into the world at a moment when this was something already going on in photography, and it soon found itself, X-rays found themselves being used for very much the same kind of purpose. We look at the X-ray today as something that operates on a pretty straightforward scientific level, but at the time that it comes into use and at the time that somebody like Hall Edwards is putting it to use, it has not only this very straightforward physical kind of meaning. You know, here you can see that we're really piercing this tire and it's not deflating, but something much closer to the wooga booga of spirit photography. That was a very prevalent way of interpreting what it was about, and so that kind of connection as well is something that within those first few months of the X-ray attached to it, despite or sometimes in collaboration with the intentions of the makers of the X-ray pictures. Speaking of medicine, this is a photograph which I show not just to make you squirm, but really because I really consider it one of the most amazing and beautiful photographic portraits that I've ever seen. And I was astounded that I was able to acquire it for the museum. I have to explain the relevance of this picture to me by explaining to you the way that we acquired it. The picture was in the booth of a photography dealer at APAD, the photography dealers convention that's held annually in New York City. He had it for about 10 years, he said. He had shown it various times. Nobody had ever taken an interest. He didn't have a name for the maker of the photographer. He didn't know who the person was in the photograph. He didn't know anything about it except that it bore these inscriptions that were pretty much illegible, complicated pencil inscriptions. A long word on the front that neither of us could make head or tail of, and a big number 2 on the back of the mount. The photograph is cropped the way that you see it here, and it's about a foot high. I was so compelled by the subject of the photograph and the way that it was rendered and just the expression on the man's face that I knew that I wanted to acquire it, and so I said, let's go ahead and do it. And soon after I made that commitment, I started looking into it and trying to figure out what this might be. The format of the picture, the oval, led me to wonder whether it might be the work of a photographer named Bontecu, who photographed for the Army of the Union during the Civil War, and photographed a number of men that had suffered grave injuries and often complications coming after those injuries that often look as vivid as this one does. But the size of the print soon proved to be completely inimical to Bontecu's work. But as I was looking in a guide to research in Civil War photography, because of that hypothesis, I came across an illustration of the catalog of photographs made for the Union Army that was published by Harvard University's Medical Museum in the 1870s. And it happened to include a long description, along with the Civil War pictures, of a photograph of a man seated with a large enchondroma of the scapula on his shoulder. And the description went on to say that the photograph was made by James Wallace Black, one of the leading photographers of our city, that is to say Boston. And indeed he is. James Wallace Black is a very well-known photographer of Boston in the 19th century. He made the first American aerial photographs, among other things, from a balloon over Boston and Providence. A wildlife photographer, a nature photographer in New Hampshire, and, as I knew only vaguely, sometimes a medical photographer for what became Mass General. That word, enchondroma, was the illegible scrawl that was on the mount of the photograph. And that lead was enough. I contacted the current curator at the Medical Museum, described to him what I'd seen, and said, oh yes, we've got 3 or 4 of those. We don't have that picture anymore, but we've got these others. So it soon proved from some of the wood engravings that had been made from some of the other images, the man himself was clearly identifiable, and the descriptions in the articles that were written by the doctors made it clear. He was a farmer from Avon, Connecticut, who had developed this enchondroma, which is a tumor of the scapula, and from his teen years until this time, sometime in his later 20s, it had grown to weigh about 36 pounds, and was soon going to be the cause of the end of his life. This photograph was made, and this comes from the description that I found completely fortuitously on that description. The tumor is beginning to bleed on the outer edge of it that you see there, and this is going to be the death of this man. But he was brought to the medical school to be observed by the students. And there are descriptions of his patience and the way that he had a kind of otherworldly peace about him, which I think is exactly what comes across in the portrait as well. I had a more involved and Mandarin reason for taking an aesthetic interest in this photograph, besides just feeling that it was a powerful portrait of a really compelling individual. And that was a connection to another photograph. And that is the famous photograph that you see at the left here by Albert Sands Southworth, half of the team of Southworth and Hawes, the great daguerreotype portraitists of Boston in the 1840s and 50s. What's known as the self-portrait of Southworth. There are a few of these pictures, in fact, unique Daguerrean, half-plate daguerreotype images of Southworth with his shirt off, and this amazing expression that seems to be one of suffering or somehow forbearance. And that connection was compelling to me. And yet one doesn't have to stop there. Once one has made the commitment to seeing that kind of human content in a picture such as this, you can go back to William Blake and his rendering of Job, or back to images of Job's New Testament equivalent, Jesus, or any number of other connections in the history of art. The point is that the human content that comes through in this picture is in part there because of the skill of James Wallace Black, a very skilled photographer, somebody versed in a variety of uses of the medium. But to a great extent, too, it comes through because of the man, or what we know about him from the description of him and his philosophical demeanor in accepting the state of his health. And that's something that photography can do. It can be the conduit and the connection to a remarkable person and a situation that has its equivalent in any number of places in the art world, as well as in the real world all around us. A third kind of connection comes across in the work of Vic Muniz. This is a picture that I've also put on view in the museum in an exhibition called Pictures of Pictures that was up last summer. A very large photograph. The projection here is only a little bit larger than the print itself, which is about 6 feet on the lower and on the horizontal side. A picture called Narcissus, after Caravaggio, from the series Pictures of Junk. And it is just that. It is a rendering of Caravaggio's painting Narcissus, rendered in junk. Is everybody able to see physically what this picture is made of, the way that it's composed? I hope that it will be clear when I show a detail a little later. The Narcissus of Caravaggio, in case it's helpful, is this, the young man looking into the reflection and falling in love with somebody that he doesn't know is himself. And this is one of a number of Baroque paintings that Muniz rendered in junk on the floor of a very large studio space in Rio de Janeiro, where he was working, and where his assistants were kids from the neighborhood. He was up above with a view camera looking down, and they were down below moving junk into the configuration that was dictated by the projected image that came out from a machine just beside the camera up above. In close-up, you can see here some of the elements that go into this, parts of machines, a tire over there at the left, a garbage can, a floor heater, and so forth. Here, there is certainly, of course, an obvious connection to art, but there's also, through the playfulness of Muniz in relation to the history of art, and in his embrace of the involvement of the children in creating the work. There's a stop-action video of this showing them doing the work, which takes a couple of days of work, is to me the powerful part of it. This is a work that really is completely impractical to imagine being made by an individual. It can only be done by a collective. There's so much work in hauling this stuff around. I suggested to him on the occasion that I once had a conversation with him, and I'm sure he's the kind of artist who gets suggestions for what he ought to do from others all the time. But I suggested he should do a picture using those cards that people hold up in stadiums. And he should maybe do the milk drop by Harold Edgerton at the scale of the entire stadium. He just smiled and said he didn't know that many people, but I kind of wonder whether it's true. He's an extremely charming person. And in fact, I want to recommend, for those who have not seen it, a really powerful movie called Wasteland that's about the making of a group of pictures related to this series of pictures, but they are, as opposed to the pictures of junk, they're pictures of garbage. And he made this with the assistance of those who sort through the garbage at the very, very large landfill just outside Rio. There's much, much more to the story, and I really encourage you to see it because it'll show you the kind of human connection that I'm talking about Muniz making with those around him, using the pretense of art and a comedic relationship to the history of fine art to do something much more productive, I think, than simply create an artwork. We've been looking here, in the case of Muniz's work, at an artist making a connection to another picture, and this is the next category I'd like to look at. It's specifically the way that you can bring one photograph into the collection, specifically because it allows you to look at another picture a little bit better than you could before. There's not just an additive effect, but really a multiplying effect in the growth of a collection. And here at Princeton, with the great advantage of the amazing collection that Peter Bunnell built over a period of 30 years, I'm able to pursue things very different from anything that was ever on the horizon in his day, and yet it's going to mean much more in this context than it ever would have if I had just come in and had a blank slate. So for example, going back to the Life and Death of Buildings exhibition, on the left you have a photograph that Peter acquired in the 1970s from a trade with George Eastman House in upstate New York. And on the right, a photograph by Daniel Lyon from the series The Destruction of Lower Manhattan that is the basis for the whole Life and Death of Buildings exhibition. A photograph of demolition of the neighborhood that gave way so that the World Trade Center could rise in its footprint. Hines' photograph is an image of men building the Empire State Building. You can see there in the lower right part of the picture the Flatiron Building. We're looking downtown there towards 23rd Street, and the Metropolitan Life Tower rising just above the upright girder. Pictures that form an amazing echo with each other. And I think it's not because Danny Lyon, however well-versed he was in the history of photography and the history of progressivism, stood there and watched these men and said, aha, now is my chance to make a picture that imitates Lewis Hines' photograph of the construction of the Empire State Building. But because he was there on the site solving the same kind of practical problem that Lewis Hines was solving, Hines said that he made pictures for two reasons: to point out things that had to be changed and to celebrate things that were worth celebrating. And the construction of the building was for him very much the latter. It was the heroism of the men doing it, and it was the magnificence of the final product, this building, which, again, is a collective project. And the great thing about it is the social expression that it stands for somebody like Hine. Lyon, of course, is facing a less romantic thing. It's the loss of this neighborhood of the 1840s and 50s that nobody had ever paid very much attention to, and which was now going to disappear without anybody doing much more than he was, making the pictures that went into the final series, The Destruction of Lower Manhattan. But this kind of connection, in which one was able to look at the way that somebody like Hine made a protagonist, both of the people and of the building, and then the way that somebody very different, somebody of about grandsons or great-grandsons relationship to somebody like Hine did about 37 years later. It's very, very powerful to me as an expression of the intelligence that is there in photography. There are only so many ways to solve a problem like this, how to stand in relation to an event such that both the environment that it's occurring in and the people in that environment are somehow the heroes of the picture. And that is what both of these photographers are doing. It becomes much clearer in looking at the two of them together, I think, than in looking at either one of them alone. And that is my point. From the sublime to the ridiculous. Excuse me a moment. This is a photograph of the British B-movie actress Deanna Dors, who in 1956 came to Hollywood and made plans to make a big splash, not of the kind that she's making here, but in the movie business of Hollywood, and to make her way into legitimate Hollywood films. In service of that aim, she convoked a big press conference in the backyard of her house, which of course was outfitted with a swimming pool. And on that occasion, somebody pushed her and some other people, or somebody fell in and a chain reaction resulted. One way or another, a UPI photographer named Stuart Sawyer was there on site and made this photograph of her emerging from the water. We know from some of the other pictures that he made, which included a view from across the pool of her falling in, that he was not the one who pushed her, but her husband thought that he was the one who pushed her in and beat him up on the spot. And because of that event, which kind of took over the whole press conference, this was kind of a wash, so to speak. This became the famous photograph after the event, famous on the very short terms of the tabloids. This is what made it into the press. A picture of Stuart Sawyer with his bloodied nose and his black eye. So I'm holding the photograph. This too I featured in the exhibition, Pictures of Pictures, as an example of the way that photography, by making an object of itself, by turning photographs into the subjects of other photographs, kind of expresses its nature as a reproductive medium and at the same time as a creative medium. Through both the creative works of people like Vic Muniz and through the very straightforward, doing a job kind of work of somebody like Stuart Sawyer. As I said, this is really the kind of the absurd end of the scale, but the interest of these pictures to me is not just in the anecdote of what's occurring here immediately, but in what we can see as the birth of post-war celebrity culture. This is a few years ahead of La Dolce Vita and the coining of the term paparazzo. But clearly that's what Stuart Sawyer was doing and what he was perceived as doing. And for those who have not seen Dolce Vita recently, I'll mention that if we think of this in terms of the comic and the tragic versions of the story, that story, of course, involves a drowned figure appearing and the photographs made of her as she's washed up on the beach and what is done about it. So as some kind of precursor of La Dolce Vita and the first notorious case of a photographer entering into the news story in Hollywood in the 1950s, I thought that there were probably any number of ways that teachers of literature or film might want to use these photographs at Princeton, and so I was able to indulge my desire to include them in the collection. Back again to something like the Sublime, but with an interesting and, to me, somewhat comic tilt to it. Two photographs that appear in The Life and Death of Buildings very close to the start of the show because they so neatly express the way that photographs are literally made of time. We think of photographs as being, as I said, about Jacobi's work, writing in light, and it is that. Photographs are about real physical spaces around us because we know how the lens and the back of the camera relate to the world outside, and so we read the camera as literally the physical trace of that place. So it's about light, it's about physics of things in the world. But photographs are also about time. There's no such thing as a truly instantaneous photograph. Every photograph is a picture of an interval of time, short or long, a fraction of a second, a few minutes, a few years. And that comes through in this pair of pictures because this photograph, as originally issued in 1858, showed the way that the Temple of Olympian Zeus looked at that time, on the afternoon that Dmitri Constantine visited the site. Note that down at the ground level here at the temple, there's a group of men standing around. There were competing cafes in the shadow of the temple, and that's what these guys are hanging out at. Up above, on the top right, notice the structure that is not part of the original ancient structure of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, but something that was added in the Middle Ages. So looking at this as archaeological time, we have, on the one hand, the present moment. We have the early years of the modern Greek state. We're in the 1850s, and these men standing around having coffee and talking to each other. Looking back much further, we get back to the age of Hadrian and the completion of the temple. And somewhere in between, the construction of what was known as the hermit's hut, the monk's hut that was built up on top of the architrave. A structure made out of local fieldstone rather than marble, and considered by archaeologists in the time of the photographer to be a kind of excrescence or a pollution on the true ancient patrimony of Athens, which is that of ancient Greece and Rome. And so, about 17 years later, the same year that Dmitri Constantine died, that monk's hut, along with the tower that was on the Acropolis and several other medieval structures in Athens, was torn down. And Constantine's heir, the heir to his studio, issued this photograph. The guys are still having coffee. So, and it's not because they were still there in 1875. It's because this is a photograph made from the same negative, with one thing changed. The studio heir has painted over the monk's hut on the negative and begun issuing new prints. And the question that I pose in the exhibition, and that I am still posing to myself, is, are we looking at a correction of the negative or a falsification of the negative? Measured by what we think of as the reason-based and physics-based language of photography, it's a falsification. The men are still there, We know what morning it is. We know that it's 1858. And yet, the facts have been changed about that date. However, if you're somebody who's just visited Athens and you want a souvenir of the temple that you just saw, and if you're somebody who's about to visit Athens and you want to know what the temple is going to look like when you get there, it's a correction of the negative. It doesn't matter very much when those men were standing down below. The language and its unity really doesn't matter of the photograph. All that matters is the information that you're looking for in it. And photography speaks simultaneously in these two modes, that of the specificity of all of the connections and relationships in the image, and that of whatever it is the person is looking for in the picture. And so we can never say very precisely just whether a photograph is true or is false. It really has to do with the way that it is used and with the claims that are made about it. This is the way the temple of Olympian Zeus looks, or this is the way that it looked at one time. And of course, the overall image here is something that was never quite the case. This leads on to the next section I'd like to talk about, having already talked about art, about the propensity of photographs to provide us with unexpected connections, and with the relationship of photographs to other pictures. I want to talk now about the practical work of the photographer and the way that specific photographs can serve as a window onto the work of photographers in a way that is sometimes interesting beyond just the anecdotal features of their career. This is a photograph that's up in the museum right now in the 19th century galleries, a picture that I acquired just this past year. And it's by André Adolphe Eugène Disdéry, who's better known as simply as Disdéry, and as the inventor of the carte de visite photograph, the portrait photograph about the size of the palm of your hand that spread like wildfire in Europe and in the US and throughout the world in the 1850s. But what we're seeing here, and what was so interesting to me as a way of embodying Disdéry's work that took us outside of carte de visite work, is an example of some of the other kinds of work that he did. Disdéry photographed at the 1855 Universal Exposition in Paris, and what we're seeing here is what to me is a very beautiful image of music because of the way that these subcontinental instruments look almost like notes on a staff of music, and also evoke, I think, the exoticness of the way that they must have looked to people at the time. But there's an extra dimension to this as well that's interesting from a photographic standpoint. And it should be as far as it can be from a reason to put a photograph into a museum, and yet it is the reason that I was keen to put this photograph in the museum. And that is that we're looking at an unfinished work of photography. What you're seeing here, what you'll see when you come to the museum and look at it, is the full sheet, the full print from the entire negative that Disdéry had in his view camera. This is a contact print. This is at a time when you cannot make an enlargement from a photograph. You can only make a negative that's the size you want the final photograph to be and print it on paper in contact with the negative itself. And what we're seeing is more than what Disdéry ever would have published, that anything more than what he would have issued as the final version of the composition. Note the way that the image falls off, as we say, at the four corners, that we're seeing the edges of the coverage of the lens. We're seeing the edges of the cone of light that comes through the lens to the back of the camera. Think about it, of course. The lens on the front of the camera always lets in a round shape, of a round image, but of course we think of photographs as being square, largely because that's the format that pictures were before photographs. And so the only way you can do that is by trimming down from that cone down to something smaller than that. Very likely the area that Disdéry intended to publish of this photograph was something like that, something much more decorous, and certainly something that makes better sense as an image. And yet what we're seeing here is the entire picture. And note across the bottom, what you're seeing is the rough edge of the sheet of paper where it was torn off of a roll, something like a paper towel. This is the real raw matter. This is the picture on its way to being a picture. And it helps to get away from the idea that photographs are instantaneous, that you make the thing by pushing a button, and then later on you get this square picture. This is at a time when there are stages of craft which are perhaps not as exotic or as involved as those of the painter conjuring a picture out of a blank surface, but which are nonetheless worth knowing about to understand what went into composing, to actually putting together the elements of a photographic picture. On a very different level, I want to talk about what to me are some of the most moving pictures that are in the Life and Death of Buildings exhibition. A group of 36 postcards made mostly in the first decade of the 20th century, but as late as the late 1920s. We're seeing 6 of them here. This is what the group of 36 looks like roughly in the show. These are photographs made on the American Great Plains of homesteaders with their claim shacks. It's people who had, following the promise of the Homestead Act and its various following acts, gone out to lay their claim to 160 acres and farm it and live as well as they could for a few years in order to ultimately lay claim to that land as their property. And so we're seeing people in everything from the very raw sod hut there in the upper right-hand corner to the man with the wooden shack just below him, who's described as Arthur by his mansion on the plains of Wyoming. And just to his left, a shack being pulled into place by a team of horses, which is a good reminder that we're not here in the Wild West. We're in the first decade of the 20th century. This is a time when some people were ordering their houses from Sears Roebuck. They were coming out on a flatbed and being pulled somewhere not very far from a train depot to where they were going to farm. What's so powerful to me about these pictures and what gives them their place in a show that's about the temporality of photographs and the temporality of buildings is that these postcards that were all mailed by the people in them to somebody else, some other individual, a member of their family, a friend, back home in Cincinnati or New York or Zurich or Paris. These pictures, in order to reach us, in order to be in the museum in this form, telling us the collective history of migration into the American West, needed to lose the meaning that they had to the person in the picture and the person who received it. That is to say, when this picture was made, it's primarily a portrait of the person with what happens to be their house. Made by an itinerant photographer traveling around asking, do you want a picture of your house on a postcard that you're then going to be able to mail? The answer was yes. It's mailed off to somebody, and the primary meaning of that picture to the person who receives it is, here is Cousin John, or whoever the person is. And that is the meaning of the picture, and it's under that rubric that it goes into the photo album or into a box or into the closet, and lives there for a generation or 2 or 3, and at some point it loses that meaning and means more to the person as $45 from eBay than it does as something knocking around in the closet, a picture of somebody we don't know anymore. The only thing we know about all of these photographs, which all belong, along with about 500 others, to a collector in Chicago, is that they lost the meaning that they once had. And now they have the meaning that that collector has given them, which is that of the collective history of migration into the American West. And that's what we're able to manifest in the museum. But only because those individual histories all melted into the loss of time as generations passed. And that to me is a very powerful statement of the way that photographs live in the world. They are out of the museum, and yet can also have a place in the museum precisely because of the complexity, the richness, and the humanity of that life that they had outside it. I'm making a pitch with this picture, again keeping on the theme of practical photographers, for an exhibition that we're just installing now that will be up by this Saturday. The exhibition is called Pattern/Picture, and it includes a number of photographs from the archives of the Clarence H. White School of Photography that operated in New York from 1914 to 1942. That archive is here at the museum. It's something that Peter Bunnell brought to the museum, in which an intern that I had this past summer helped to organize and photographed the works in that archive. This is a sample of the work that's in the show. It's a photograph of safety pins, and I wonder if everybody can see the safety pins once you know what it's a picture of. We're looking, as in Jacobi's photograph, it's a photogenic image, we're looking straight down, but now through a camera, at a piece of paper, and the safety pins have been pushed into it. And what you're seeing primarily is the shape of their shadow, the shadow of each pin. The light comes from above, from the top, and down these rows of safety pins that are pushed in at this regular interval on the sheet of cardboard or paper. These shadows are cast down, and that's what you see in the picture. The Clarence White School was a place where photographers were trained by one of the great masters of pictorialist photography at the turn of the century to prepare themselves for a career as commercial photographers. And as in work like this, often making photographs that would be printable as patterns on fabrics or usable in advertisements for everyday objects such as safety pins. It's an interesting case of the practical side of photography being precisely disguising what it is you're representing. It was to create picture puzzles of a certain kind. There's a whole range of these represented in the show. Some of them are quite intriguing, and I hope you'll come and see it. They're very engaging pictures. Lastly, I want to talk, having talked about practical photography, about what I would call philosophical photography. Photographs that belong in the museum not because there's something difficult or keen or worth belaboring about the technical way that the photograph was made, but in the same way that we can look at the work of somebody like Marcel Duchamp and say, this work belongs in a museum because it doesn't really belong anywhere else. It's a philosophical object. It's some, as Duchamp said, is it possible to make a work that is not a work of art? And with that challenge, created a whole way of thinking about art as conceptual behavior that is carried out still today by photographers in a variety of different ways. This photograph as well will appear in the pattern picture show just because of the way that it echoes some of the very straightforward patterns that are created by those Clarence White School students. But as you see, what it is in fact is a photograph very much like you might find on someplace like eBay if somebody was selling 3 years worth of practical photography magazine and they wanted to show you what it looked like. Very straightforward kind of image, the kind that you might be able to make with a handheld camera. And yet the point for this photographer, Torbjørn Rødland, who's a Norwegian photographer who makes very different photographs. You won't recognize his work from one image to the next because he's always evolving and doing very distinct things. What he's doing in a picture like this, among other things, I think he's invoking, on the one hand, the tradition of minimalist sculpture. We're looking at a stack, as Donald Judd called his works of art. Also, simply the joke of the thing itself, the practical photography run of magazines that he's looking at, and the practical photography that he's doing here, something very much like eBay sort of photography. And the very entertaining list of topics that's described on the spines of these magazines, everything from a fungi challenge to photographers to now is the time to photograph lighthouses, and all of these invocations to do all of these different things in photography, combined with the very mundane thing that he has done with the photograph. This is a picture which, again, is quite large in scale, and the size of it, the fact that it sort of functions as literally a sign, as something like a traffic sign, is part of what gives it the humor that it has, and also, I think, helps to make it function on the level of conceptual activity. On a much more serious note, the work of Thomas Roof, that is the largest piece that's in The Life and Death of Buildings. is from his series called the JPEG series. This image is called JPEG CO01. CO stands for collapsing towers, and the JPEGs of the CO series are all images made on September 11th, 2001 in New York City. They're photographs made not by Roof himself, but by others, and uploaded onto the internet where he has taken them. Usually small pictures, images that were quite small on the screen, which he has blown up to, in this case we're looking at a projection that's smaller than the print itself. The print itself is about 9 feet high. And the effect of blowing up this picture is that the basis of the JPEG, the compression, the pixel, becomes physically evident. We think of virtual reality on the one hand and real reality, I guess, on the other. And what this image is about, in part, is the fact that virtual reality is real, that pixels have a physical existence, that the informational structure of a JPEG or of anything that's on the internet or of anything that helps to inform us about the world has its basis somehow in a physical reality. Roof is also, I think, involving us in the visual language of history painting, of grand and monumental images of the world around us, and at the same time reminding us of just the puniness of the means by which we learn about the world around us today. And so there's some kind of connection being made between the different scales at which people conceive of history in a time like the 19th century and a time like today. And finally, the image functions on the level of abstraction because unlike this experience in which you are able to see this as the collapsing of the tower instantaneously, when you confront it at first in the exhibition, now of course I'm spoiling it for you, but when you confront it first in the exhibition and first can see the image close up, it works simply like the detail that you see it right, as a virtually abstract image of these squares. And so all these different historical levels of connection are the ones that Roof is making. Not as a photographer in the classic sense of somebody dealing with a camera, but in the sense of somebody thinking about what photographic images mean and how they mean. Lastly, this photograph, which is really one of my favorites in the Life and Death of Buildings exhibition. A picture by Tim Davis called Coliseum Pictures. An image of 23 point-and-shoot digital cameras face down on the cobblestones in the shadow of the Colosseum in Rome. Each of them portraying on its screen its most recent exposure, portraying the Colosseum itself. We're certainly back at something at least as sardonic as Lynn Cohen's photograph of a motel room with the New York City skyline on its wall. But I think besides the irony and the humor of Tim Davis's picture, there's also something sincere here and something that in the tradition of pop art and Andy Warhol's insistence that what he was doing had not to do with mockery of any kind, but with a real love and embrace of the popular life of the 20th century. I think we're seeing here an appreciation of exactly what it is that photographs mean and why photographs mean, to return to that question that Roof proposed answering on a very large and political level. That is to say that photographs mean something like what those postcards meant to the people who wanted an image to send to their family member. None of us has the illusion that by taking a point-and-shoot camera to Rome and making that absurd, futile picture of the Colosseum, we're adding somehow to architectural history or to insights on the art of photography. But what we are doing is inserting ourselves into that history. We're engaging with the medium and bringing it into our lives and bringing our lives and photography somehow into conversation in a way that's very intuitive and that doesn't require a lot of theoretical development in order to see the value of it. That is to say that, as I mentioned, the temporal dimension of photography, the understanding of photography not as about the space of the world or about the behavior of light, but about time and our relationship to time. Precisely because every photograph is made in and of time, and because we understand it very much on the level of our own snapshots as being about time. This is the time that I was in Rome. This is the third time I was in Rome. Here's when I was in Rome when my daughter was only 2. This relationship to time, I think, is the enduring dimension of photography that from its beginning to the present, and from the time of the daguerreotype to the digital era, has been a part of the way that photographs work, and the reason why they have the particular power they do, and why photographs belong in the museum, because they come from out of it. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer questions or your observations if you'd like. Oh, yes.
What do you think of digital versus analog photography in terms of its observability? Its museum quality or its interest.
Right. Well, as I've just suggested, I think there's any number of levels on which photographs might be of museum quality, whether or not they're something made with a high degree of technical acuity. Roof, as it happens, for example, is an extremely capable handler of a camera and very well-versed in what the possibilities of digital as opposed to analog photography are. And I think there's latitude for virtuosity in digital photography as there is in any other form of making pictures. I would also say that the important thing about digital photography is not that there's, on the one hand, large format photography, and then there's color photography, and then there's snapshot photography, and then there's digital photography. Photography has been swept into that great big thing, the digital, along with everything else. That digital is the bigger category, and photography is one small part of it, not the other way around. And in taking that perspective, I think it's a matter of solving the problem. How do you do something that's germane to the digital future of photography in digital photography? That is to say, photographs, analog photography is going to be the province of craftsmen, hobbyists. It's not going to be the medium of the future that photography has always been. It seems as though digital photography contains none of the genes that made photography the intimate connection to the world that it was. It seems that all of a sudden we're in a realm where anything might be changed with a flick of the finger on a keyboard, and so it seems a little bit dubious and suspect and frightening and unhealthy. And yet, I think nothing, it changes everything and yet nothing about photography, that it's moved into this new realm. I think the history of photography is the history of the decay of its technology. Peter Pinelli used to often say photography was born perfect in the daguerreotype, and we've been figuring out how to make it bad enough that everybody can do it ever since. And maybe it's reached a state of perfection with the digital camera, and certainly with something like the iPhone that now makes any number of adjustments to everything in making a picture. I don't have any single answer to that, but on the level of the durability of digital photograph, I have the same concerns that I think everyone has about moving into the cloud, as we say in this kind of frightening way. The idea that your photographs are no longer physical objects in an album or a box, but instead are something that is not even on your computer, but is somewhere neither here nor there, at the sufferance of the ghost of Steve Jobs being preserved, is disturbing for a medium of memory. And it's hard to know what to suggest about that, what to do about it, except to print out what matters to you most, the way you always do. Yes?
Your impression of the exhibit at Firestone by George Siegel?
I am ashamed to say that I have not yet been. That is how abashed I am. Yes, so that's how busy I've been. I've just come back from a trip, and the exhibition at the museum is just wrapping up this week, and I look forward to having my life back as of next week. Everything that I've seen of it and what I saw in the Princeton magazine this week, for those who have seen that feature on the show, is very exciting. We have a small group of Siegel's work at the museum, but nothing, of course, like what's over at the library now. It's among the glories of being at Princeton that, despite how magnificent the collection of photographs is at the museum, it's one of the smaller collections of photographs on campus. And what's at Firestone, what's in the mud, what's in the archives, it's really awe-inspiring. Yes?
What's the digital photograph shows 9/11? Was that touch? It looked like shades of green photograph. And then just talking about instant changes in photography, whether you use Photoshop or whatever. Obviously, there's a lot of potential for the artist saying something just by putting it in Photoshop. You know about that photograph?
All of the JPEG photographs are straight in the sense of simply being enlargements of the pixelated information that was there. And something like that, when it shrinks down, you begin to see the way that the very small sensor in the camera was interpreting the light reaching it. There's quirks in little digital photographs for sure. Some of those pictures too, bear in mind, are not necessarily from digital photographs in the first place. At some point they're scanned, and at some point they make their way onto the internet. The only thing that we know about them is that at some point they're on the web, and that's where Roof gets them. And it is a powerful thing for me to remember that on that day, cell phone cameras were not a part of our lives. That, for example, if they were, we would have very different images of 9/11 than we do. We would have images made by the people in the towers. It's really within just a couple of years that cell phone cameras begin to outnumber all other cameras in the world. And now, of course, they're way beyond the number of all other cameras in the world. But that moment is kind of the first digital disaster of our era, was just prior to that stage of digital photography.
It seems to me that there's a strong relation between photography and when I first started in college in the 60s with the dark room and whatever, you sit with the negative and you're dialing up colors, and you're dodging, and you're burning, and you're solarizing, and you're twisting the paper. You're doing the same thing with chemicals and with light that you're doing now without the poisonous fumes.
Yep.
But you're doing it with Photoshop. But it's the same kind of thing. You're changing the hue and the intensity and your brightness. So I don't think that it's really that different in terms of what the creative process. What is different is the accessibility of that to more people, to everyone. Almost a democratization of photography that allows everyone to see the world and show the world as they see it.
Absolutely, yeah. This allows me to get in a plug for my wife's exhibition that'll, a year from today at the Metropolitan, called Faking It, Manipulated Photography Before Photoshop. That is the history, going back to the 1840s, of what we think of as manipulated photographs. And when you think about it, that phrase, manipulated photographs, it seems like an intuitive phrase. It seems like we know what it means, but what's a manipulated painting? What's a manipulated sculpture? What's a manipulated sentence? There's some idea, there's some platonic concept of a straight photograph, which, as you're very rightly pointing out, is very rarely achieved. You very rarely see something that is a straight photograph. I don't know what it would be, a surveillance camera image or something like that. One is always making choices about composition to begin with, where you point the camera, and moving on from there. It's a whole succession of human choices that are controllable by one technology or another, for sure. Well, thank you very much.